worldview and religion. What do we mean by worldview? What does that mean? So this could be an entire course. So we could talk the entire semester just on worldview. But for our purposes, just a couple of definitions here. Conceptual system, or a particular way of looking at the world by which a person or a group of people understand and engage life. For our purposes, think about the frame over here as the worldview. Okay, so it shapes how we see things. With this circle here, there are things over here around the circle that we don't see because of the frame, right? But it's really focusing us in such that there are some parts of this picture that we see more clearly, right? Like we're probably not paying a lot of attention to this cloud back here. We're probably not paying a lot of attention to this part of the mountain, right? We're probably focusing to the center here on the sunrise or sunset, whichever one it is. And so it's excluding from our view some things, but it's emphasizing some other things, right? So this is one of the ways that we want to think about worldview. It's kind of shaping the way that we perceive the world. So a worldview then is a semiotic system of narrative signs, and semiotic here pertains to signs. This comes from the Greek word. Semeion that's the Greek word for sign. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. Semiotic is the study of signs and signification. So worldview then is a semiotic system of narrative signs that creates the definitive symbolic universe, which is responsible in the main for the shape of a variety of life-determining human practices. So whenever you see something and that thing, let's say that we have some sort of symbolic meaning for birds, then when you see a bird, that signifies, that points to something else, right? That's what we mean by a sign. It signifies, right? It signifies something else. Worldview is an articulation of the basic beliefs embedded in a shared grand story that are rooted in a faith commitment that gives shape and direction to the whole of our individual and corporate lives. Now, rooted in a faith commitment here, might need to massage this a little bit, just because this would only apply to religious worldviews, and there are non-religious worldviews that need to be allowed for here. But for our purposes, you kind of get these three definitions, and hopefully that'll help you get your hands around it. Some of the divisions of worldview are metaphysics. What's the nature of ultimate reality? So what exists? Epistemology, how do we know what we know? Ethics, how should we live? Aesthetics, what is beautiful, what is tragic, what's funny? Origin, where did we come from? Problem, what's wrong with the world? Remember back to Buddhism, all life is suffering. Suffering comes from desire. If we get rid of desire, then we get rid of suffering, and we can do that through the Eightfold Path. That is, they're trying to solve this problem, right? So the solution, how do we fix it? Well, the Eightfold Path, or the Four Noble Truths, try to handle both of these, right? They handle the problem, and then they handle the solution, right? So that's part of that worldview. So you can see already that religion and worldview are kind of overlapping a little bit. Now they're not exactly the same thing. Your religion is going to be a part of your worldview, but there are some significant similarities there. Okay. So history here, some of the things that we're going to have to grapple with, try to kind of understand the emergence of this idea of a worldview. Rene Descartes begins a fundamental shift in philosophy by suggesting that we should start with the self instead of starting with God. So ancient philosophers, Christian and not, tend to start with transcendental, tend to start with the thing that's beyond us and then work its way down to us, right? That tends to be kind of the way that things are done. Rene Descartes turns that around, and he says we're going to start with us and we're going to move our way in the other direction. So this is the origin of his famous cogito ergo sum, which means I think, therefore I am, right? That's what cogito ergo sum means. It's Latin, just cogito, I think, ergo, therefore, sum, I am. So cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore, I am. What he's saying here is, I can doubt all things. He actually starts this with debito ergo sum, actually, is the origin of it is, and that's, I doubt, therefore I am. So the idea is, I can doubt all of these things. I can doubt the external world. I can doubt everything that I see. I can doubt my sense experience. But in doing so, there's always me doubting. And so if I'm doubting, then I have to exist. Because otherwise, I'm not doubting. There has to be a me to doubt, right? There has to be a subject to the verb, basically, is what he's saying. And so he generalizes that a bit to I think, instead of just I doubt. He generalizes it to I think, therefore I am. And then two camps emerge from this perspective, each with a different answer for how we acquire truth. Rationalists say we do so through deduction. Empiricists say we do so through sense experience. So rationalists are going to think their way to truth. Empiricists are going to test their way to truth. You can think of this, generally speaking, as rationalist as a philosopher, empiricist as a scientist, right? Those are kind of the divide, right? So after this, we get a guy named Immanuel Kant. And Kant is super famous in philosophy. For one reason, there's all of the Kant puns, right? I can't understand, right? You know, that kind of stuff. So that happens all the time. Saw a meme once that said 0 days since the last Kant pun, and it was hung in a philosophy department. So Kant attempts to fuse rationalism and empiricism. So he affirms our sense experience, but our minds aren't perfect at perceiving. So he wants to try to affirm both sides of this. The analogy here, one of the ways that we can kind of get our heads around this, is a bent stick in water. If we perceive it as bent, are we right, or is the water impacting our ability to see the truth? If you've done this before, you just take a stick, something straight, put it in the water. As it goes into the water, it looks like it bends, right? There's an optical illusion from the water. There's a fancy name for that. I don't forget what it is. But you put that into the water, and then it produces an optical illusion, makes it look like it's bent. So then we know what reality is. We know that the stick is not bent, but our sense perception is telling us that it is. So that's the disjunction here, is that there is an objective external reality, but our ability to understand the objective external reality is flawed. So the result is his suggestion of a phenomenal realm. So this is phenomenon, right? You know, what kind of phenomenon? You can try to make some connections there with the language. This is what we can experience. And then there's the noumenal realm. And this comes from a word for mind in Greek. The noumenal realm is extrasensory things which aren't which aren't objects of knowledge. Sorry, I noticed that I missed a parenthesis there, so that tripped me up a little bit. And so phenomenal realm and the noumenal realm, right? So noumenal realm is, your ideas and things that you can perceive. It's the bent stick, right? And so that's phenomenal realm, the noumenal realm. Okay. So this is the opposite of the classical perspective found in Plato. Plato says that the visible world is the world of opinion, and the invisible world is the world of knowledge. So Kant is saying that it's the other way around. Plato's perspective is that what we see is sort of transient. What we can't see is immutable and perfect, and that's the realm of knowledge. And most early Christian theologians, by the way, were Platonic in to some degree, some very Platonic. And so Kant just kind of flips this around. The result of this is it makes God the object of opinion and not knowledge. So Kant kind of famously says, "I have therefore found it necessary to deny knowledge to make room for faith," which is just, whoa, right? So from his perspective, there's one correct worldview at which we could all arrive by the right use of autonomous human reason. Hopefully this is starting to kind of connect the idea of a worldview, right? If we starting the philosophical theological journey with us and moving up towards God, then that starts to, we start to have to consider, like, what are the layers in between us and our understanding of God, right? So this is where we start our journey of analyzing worldviews. We've inherited the assumptions of people like Kant, or maybe from Plato, and these assumptions play a huge role in the conclusions that we make, okay? Just a gigantic role, okay? A couple other people to talk about just briefly. There's a few other pieces of development here in worldviews. Dilthey says worldview is historically and culturally relative and pre-rational. Therefore, we reason from it, not to it. Abraham Kuyper's kind of famous for saying there's not one square inch in all of creation which the Christ who is sovereign over all does not cry out, "Mine, this belongs to me." I don't really like this quote because it makes Jesus kind of sound petulant. It makes him sound kind of like an infant to me, or a toddler rather, not an infant, but a toddler that's just like, "That's my toy," right? So I've never really been a big fan of this quote, but he's famous for saying that. And he believed that there's a uniquely Christian way to do art, science, education, etc. This forms an antithesis to all competing worldviews. And so he really latches onto this worldview concept and says there's a unique Christian way to do all of these things, and Christianity produces a coherent way of viewing the world, right? So our frame here then, a large part of this frame for him would be Christianity. He would pretty well overlap religion and worldview, such that, if you have the right religion and you're doing it correctly, then you have the right worldview and you do all of these things correctly. Francis Schaeffer popularizes the concept of Christian worldview among evangelicals. He affirms, and Kuyper, or somebody that I didn't mention, but he's less important, that the Christian faith forms a unified and coherent vision of all life, and that this vision stands in irreconcilable opposition to all competing non-Christian visions of life. So again, Kuyper and Schaeffer are really kind of coming from this Reformed perspective, juxtaposing a Christian worldview against every other possible worldview, and saying there is a unique way of seeing the world that is uniquely Christian, and it is the right way to see the world, and all other ways, by virtue of not being that way, are incorrect. Now, to back up a bit, the classical view of worldview, there are these self-evident things called first principles. And so we have, in philosophy and in theology way back, people writing things called on first principles. Origen, one of my favorite early church theologians, writes on first principles. So we have natural revelation and first principles of reason, and this is sort of our foundation for everything that we believe. Then as you move up, right, you start to build off of these things. You build kind of secular life, right? And then you continue to build on these things, but you also build on this. And you notice here you have kind of a sharp divide. That sharp divide is, on top of this, you have special revelation, and then you have faith. Okay, so this is what's available to everybody. And then built on what's available to everybody, we have kind of the way that we do society. And then based on top of that, we also have available to us special revelation, but that special revelation might not be available to everybody. It's special, right? Special revelation is scripture, that sort of thing, right? So if scripture is not in somebody's language or something like that, then it's not necessarily available to them. So you build that on top of all of this stuff, and then from there you build your faith, right? And so one of the issues here is that this means that religious faith is not necessary for proper knowledge of the universe. That's not necessarily incorrect, but that could present an issue based on your understanding of the world. Some people are going to take issue with that. Schaeffer, who and Kuyper, who are saying that you have to have a Christian worldview in order to properly understand the universe, right? That there's one correct worldview, and that correct worldview is a Christian worldview. Well, if you take this view and you say, well, faith and special revelation, they're higher up on this chart, I can just live down here and understand the universe without actually building that religious worldview. That's going to stand at odds with somebody like Schaeffer or with Kuyper, right? Another view of this, kind of a more generic view of this, the fall corrupts not only our beliefs but our ability to make beliefs. And this is, again, just kind of generic worldview. We have worldview beliefs. This is just sort of like what you grow up believing, whatever you inherit from society, right? And based on those worldview beliefs, you develop everything in life, right? Everything that you believe, everything that you want to do. And as the result of this is conversation with people outside of Christianity is often frustrating because our supposed common reason is not actually shared, right? If my worldview beliefs are over here, right, and your worldview beliefs are over here, well, what do we have in common? If I believe that there's a God that exists, right, and you don't believe that, well, there's a whole lot of things that I'm going to point to that relate to God, right? Say, God did this, God did this, God did this. And you're going to say, well, that concept isn't even meaningful to me, right? Like there's nothing there. I don't believe that even exists. And so one of the things that we have to do, one of the reasons that this concept of worldview is important is if we recognize that there's this kind of divide, when there often is, we have to recognize that divide and then figure out some way to bridge that divide. We have to see something over here that we can connect to and say, I have that in my worldview too, right? Like, so here's a way that we can connect. Here's a way that we can have conversations, right? We have to be able to do that. Otherwise, we're going to say things that, this is like when you try to talk to somebody and you're just using Christianese and they're just confused. Like, what are you even talking about? I don't understand any of the things that you're saying, right? It just doesn't come across. It just doesn't work, right? And so there's got to be more to it, right? Social imaginary, this is kind of a more recent development of worldview, and this really fleshes out what we were just talking about the divide between two worldviews. And this is the notion of plausibility structures in particular. Plausibility structures are belief-forming apparatus that acts as a gatekeeper, letting in evidence that is matched against what we already consider to be possible. Plausibility structures filter out claims that we believe cannot be reasonable or potentially true. Okay, that's really key. Okay, filter out claims that we believe cannot be reasonable or potentially true. They don't necessarily tell us if a claim is true, only that the truth of the claim appears plausible enough for us to accept it, and that we are not wholly unwarranted in thinking it could be true. Instead, we are all situated culturally and historically within our own worldviews. So plausibility structure is an example of this. Is a great quote here. For example, if I were to find a box of cookies in my kitchen cabinet, I would assume that my wife had bought them at the store and placed them there herself. If someone were to argue that tree-dwelling elves baked the cookies, packaged them for their corporate employer, and stashed them in my pantry, would have a difficult time believing their claim. The existence of unionized tree-dwelling elves is simply not part of my plausibility structure. So simply put, plausibility structures represent what you're willing to consider as true, Okay, and so for the issue here is that for a growing number of people in the world, Christianity is as incoherent as Keebler Elves. This is where this concept of plausibility structures. I mean, you can kind of imagine plausibility structures as just pillars, right? And if you try to give somebody an idea, and that idea has no pillars to land on, almost misspelled idea there. If there are no pillars built up to support that idea, they're not going to accept it, right? And so this is why, like, if you try to give them Keebler elves, right? If this is the elf, right? But you've done nothing to support the idea that elves are true or elves are real or whatever, right? You haven't built that up, then that belief, that worldview belief, is just going to collapse. They're not going to accept it, right? And so there has to be some sort of scaffolding to illustrate why this is an actually rational thing to believe, right? If I were to say there's an invisible pink elephant behind you, you wouldn't believe me, or at least you shouldn't believe me, right? Unless I build up for you the scaffolding that explains like why you should believe that, why you should trust me that that's something that exists in this world. Okay, so what is ultimate reality? What are these worldviews? When we say worldview, what are some of the things that we're talking about? So atheism, pantheism, deism, panentheism, and theism. These are kind of some umbrella worldviews. This isn't exhaustive, but this gives you an idea. Ultimate reality, if all ultimate reality is just the material world, right? If that's all there is, ultimate reality is the material world, then there are non-theistic worldviews. Okay, non-theistic worldviews are going to be atheism, and then also monism and pantheism. Monism, if you know monotheism, monotheism is the worship of one God. Monism just means there's one thing. There's just one thing. Well, monism kind of collapses into materialism to some degree, at least in the sense that there's just one thing. Even if the one thing is spiritual, it falls to the same problems as materialism, right? Pantheism is that God and the universe are coterminous. They're the same thing, right? And so God and the universe are one, co-equal, co-extensive. So there's no separation whatsoever between God and the world. So that's pantheism. Okay, so these are kind of non-theistic. Now I know I say non-theistic. There's a God here, right, in this one, but pantheism, depending on it, the expression of it, that God may not really qualify as what we would call as God. Okay, if ultimate reality is God or gods, etc., these are theistic worldviews. We've got deism, we've got theism, and then multiple forms of theism. Deism is the belief that God and the universe are separate, and there's not really any interaction here, right? So deism is sort of like the watchmaker thesis. God creates the world and just kind of lets it run. Okay. Polytheism, henotheism. Polytheism means that there are many gods. Henotheism believes that there are many gods, but there's only one worthy of worship. Okay, so that's what that means, right? There are multiple gods, like there's a pantheon of gods, a multitude of gods, but only one of them is worthy of worship. Panentheism is similar to pantheism, but notice that little "in." So what we have here in pantheism is we have all, and then theism is God, right? Well, here we have all, in actually means in, and God. Okay, so panentheism is that everything, the universe, is in God, right? That's what that means. Okay, and then monotheism. Monotheism is pretty self-explanatory, right? And then, sorry, I meant to explain the last one here. It's complicated. I add that one in here because there are some religions that I would call transtheistic. What I mean by that is you can kind of see this in Black Panther in the Marvel Universe. There are deities. They have a deity called Bast, which they're actually borrowing from Egyptian religion. But they have a deity called Bast. Bast exists, but Bast kind of doesn't matter, right? The idea there is, and this happens frequently in a lot of indigenous religions, there are gods, but the gods aren't ultimate reality. There's something else that's ultimate reality. So the gods exist, but they kind of aren't the most important thing. Okay. Religion and worldviews, to kind of give you a map from where things land here. Christianity and Islam, there are Christians and there are Muslims that fall in all of these categories. Okay. There are Christians that are theists, panentheists, deists, and pantheists. You can't really be a Christian or a Muslim and be an atheist. That doesn't really fly. Okay, can't really do that. You know, yeah, it just doesn't work. I don't understand how that would really work out. Then Judaism, Hinduism, and Buddhism, all of these can actually be in atheism. And I know that seems weird, but we'll talk about it more when we get especially to Judaism, but also Hinduism and Buddhism. They can all be atheistic, pantheistic, deistic, panentheistic, theistic. They can fit into any of these. Okay.